For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. Croeso. This is James, aka JP Harker, coming to you with a booktube / authortube type video looking at the book The Hollow Crown by Dan Jones, which is The Wars of the Roses and the Rise of the Tudors. Reason this is both booktube and authortube is it's a look at and a review of a book, but it's a research book, and authors who are writing fantasy or medieval fantasy especially, I would always strongly advise reading this sort of thing, because in my not particularly humble opinion, good research is vital when you're trying to write realistic fantasy. And this book is an excellent reference for one of our more interesting periods. So, overall, brilliant. There's very little bad that I can say about this book. I keep tapping down here as if you can see it. The book is on the desk, just I'm not tapping my leg for no readily apparent reason. It is excellent overall. It's very informative, it's very interesting, and I can recommend it. I'm going to give a brief overview of what it's about, which is essentially a brief overview of the Wars of the Roses, or the Cousins' War. I'm not going to go into vast amounts of detail by the book, but it's a complicated subject even to someone fairly familiar with it, so I'll give a fairly rough outline. Henry V, of Agincourt fame, and Shakespeare fame, and Ken Branagh fame, dies at the age of 35. Now, having recently won at Agincourt, he's been made heir to the Kingdom of France, as well as being King of England. And in theory, that's brilliant, because the King of France is old, he'll die. Henry, who's a very strong and capable king, will become king of both nations, and the hard work of making it into a united semi-empire should be no problem for such a man. Trouble is, he dies at 35, and his son, also Henry, is only 9 months old, and is in no position to do anything. Now, the Shakespeare line, his realm, of which so many had the managing, they lost France and made his England bleed, is not far off the mark. Beginning as a child who's incapable of doing anything, Henry VI grows up into an adult who's incapable of doing anything. He is, it sounds harsh, but he's a very indecisive, overtly pious, and largely weak-willed man who lets himself be dominated first by his various uncles, and then by his wife, and then by court favourites, who happen to be court favourites of his wife, and his own cousin, and he's very submissive, and that's really not what you want from a medieval king. So factionalism begins first with people like Humphrey of Gloucester and the Bishop of Winchester, and there's them fighting one another, and then we have characters like Earl of Somerset, Earl of Salisbury, and Earl of Suffolk, and the Duke of York, and it's basically a big mess of who can try and fix this dreadful situation we're in, where first we have a child king, and then we have a useless adult king, and we've got 2 countries to run who've been enemies for 100 years. So factionalism begins and chaos reigns, and eventually France, through a mixture of ill luck and ill judgment, is lost. Henry and some of his advisors, namely Duke of Somerset, are blamed for this, and Richard, Duke of York, who was recently Lieutenant of France and got moved out because he wasn't a court favourite, decides, I've had enough of this, I'm taking control. And he has a couple of goes at taking power and being Lord Protector, and when that doesn't particularly work for him, he claims the crown. He To cut a long story short, both he and Henry are descended from King Edward III, so both have a claim to be king. And Henry's grandfather had seized the crown militarily, so his claim wasn't that much stronger than York's, and York was a capable man. So he makes this claim and says, "Make me your heir," which Henry does. Unfortunately, Henry's wife isn't particularly keen on this, that's Margaret of Anjou, because it disinherits Henry's son, so she gathers troops, fights York, and he's killed at the Battle of Wakefield. His adult son, Edward, Earl of March, keeps going in this fight, claims, "Well, I should be king now," wins a victory at Mortimer's Cross, and takes the throne. And Henry VI and his wife have to flee to exile. So, wife has to flee to exile, Henry VI is captured. That goes well for a little while. Trouble is, one of the people who was instrumental in putting Edward IV on the throne was a man named Warwick, who was a very, very powerful lord. He's called Warwick the Kingmaker. And Edward rather offends him by marrying a Englishwoman as opposed to the French princess that Warwick was arranging a marriage with. And in alienating him, he loses his most powerful supporter. Warwick first rebels and then joins up with the Lancastrians. I don't like the Yorkists Lancastrian things, but he joins up with Margaret of Anjou, and they try and make Henry VI king again. This sort of works for a while, and Edward has to run off to Burgundy, but he comes back again about a year later, takes the crown again. Warwick is killed at the Battle of Barnet, and Edward, Prince of Wales, who was Henry's son, is killed at Tewkesbury. So, Edward IV is now king, and becomes king, and stays king for about 10 years. Dies of natural causes. Unfortunately, once again we're faced with a child king, in the form of Edward V, who is, shall we say, removed and replaced by Richard III. There's a lot of chat. He's fair play to him, he's fairly fair about the situation around this. The usurpation or replacement, or whatever you want to call it, of Edward V with Richard III is a matter of controversy, and it's dealt with well in this book. I liked that. But Richard III becomes king in 1483, and in 1485, a young lad called Henry Tudor crosses over, fights Richard's army at Bosworth Field, and Richard is killed. And that is the official end of the medieval period in England. We can time it almost to the hour when we stop being medieval, and the age of the Tudors begins. That's, long story short, of Wars of the Roses. This covers all of that in much, much better detail, and it also covers a little bit about the Tudors before they were famous, where we had Owen Tudor, who had married Henry V's widow, and his children. We have Edmund and we have Jasper, who are fairly interesting people in their own right. It would have been, part of me thinks it would have been nice to see more of that, but then there wouldn't have been space for all the other stuff, and it's a fairly hefty book. But it's made me want to read more about them. It's made me want to read more about a few people, which is always good. But yes, that's more or less what this book is about. It covers the start of Henry VII, Henry Tudor's reign, and there's a bit about that, but not a great deal, because it's only about the rise of the Tudors, not the world of the Tudors. But interesting enough. So I've rambled on enough about that. We'll stop that there. As you probably guessed, I'm recommending this book quite highly. Now, I would normally go into pros and cons and do the cons first. Unfortunately, or fortunately in this case, there's almost nothing bad about this book. I mean, it takes a long time to read, but it's a good read, it's an interesting read, and it's written in such a way that you don't feel bored reading it, even though it's a book of fact. It's not, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this on this date, that on that date. And it's not even a case of just, this happened, which is related to this, which ties into this, which ties into that, which is an interesting way of doing it. It's written, in some ways, occasionally, almost like a novel. There's parts of it where you're going into the minds of the people involved, not just the political ramifications of their actions. You're thinking, well, what was he thinking? What was his personality? And to me, that makes it even better as a source of research and as something that's fun to read. That's me. I've written down good examples of that. There's The Execution of Margaret Pole and The Near Execution of Thomas Curver. They're two very good sections that are described in detail and as almost as drama rather than as fact. And there's quite a few of them, and that makes it... I've used the word interesting a lot, but there's not really a good substitute for that. There we go. So, to conclude, as I'm sure you'll be grateful to know, a very well-written book. You empathise with the characters the way that you would if they were in a novel. Very, very informative. I've made copious notes on this. And if you're interested in this period in history, obviously, read it. But if you're writing fantasy, and as I've said before, particularly medieval fantasy, this is filled with some brilliant ideas and characters who were real. You think, well, my guy could be kind of like that. Or, as you find annoyingly, if you've already planned something, you think, this has already happened in real life and I didn't know it. But that's my problem. I'm not going to go into that. So I'm going to end on a high note. A very good book, would highly recommend. I'm going to flash it up once again. The Hollow Crown by Dan Jones. If you have an interest in medieval history or an interest in writing fantasy, buy this book, read this book. It is excellent. Right, usual drill. Subscribe, like, comment, share, do what all you kids do with YouTube videos these days, and I shall see you again another time. This is JP Harker. Hwyl fawr.